Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The story of Pete Rose is like a Greek tragedy of the 20th century America. Pete Rose was one of its biggest sports stars. The Sporting News claimed him to be Athlete of the Decade for the 1970s. He broke what seemed to be the insurmountable career hits record set by Ty Cobb in 1985. The moment was broadcast on networks across the country. I remember where I was when I was a kid when it happened. He was an integral part of several historically important World Series winning teams, in a style of play made almost everyone either love him or hate him. He was nicknamed Charlie Hustle by another iconic baseball player, Mickey Mantle, who was actually mocking him, but the name stuck and became a term of endearment by those who loved him. But the story of Pete Rose is also a tragic story. He had a gambling problem, and it and his battles with Major League Baseball over it would turn Pete Rose from a baseball icon to one of its most notorious figures. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life and times of Pete Rose, which still includes today. Pete Rose is still alive. My guest is Keith O'Brien. Keith O'Brien is the author of the book Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Keith O'Brien, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks for having me, Mitch. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, we don't do a lot of sports on this program, but I am a sports fan. And in fact, if you were to talk to people who know me best, they'd say go to the original word of fan, fanatic, would probably be more accurate. And I thought this, even as I was preparing yesterday for our conversation today, the great timing it is to talk about Pete Rose right now. And I say that because the way that Major League Baseball, but other professional sports leagues as well, have fully embraced legalized gambling to a point that I personally think is dangerous, and we could talk about that. But then I wake up this morning and I see the breaking news that Major League Baseball suspended several players, one permanently, for actually gambling. So gambling is back big time when we talk about sports.
Oh, it's back all right, Mitch. This morning, Tucupita Marcano, player for the Pirates and the Padres, has been banned for life for betting on baseball games, allegedly hundreds of baseball games. And in doing so, Marcano, joins a very short list that obviously does include Pete Rose, 35 years ago, banned from baseball forever for also betting on his own games, his own team. And, that this is one reason why I wanted to do the book. In the last 35 years, the world has changed in significant ways. And it's changed, especially in the past 6 years since the sweeping legalization of gambling across America. Last year in America, we legally wagered on sports, legally, Mitch, $120 billion. That's billion with a B. Just to put that in perspective for folks, if we had instead pooled our money instead of wagering it, pooled that $120 billion, we could have purchased every single Major League Baseball team and still had about $50 billion jangling around in our pockets. It's an enormous sum of money. It is fundamentally changing sports. I think it's fundamentally changing us, changing our culture, changing our kids, changing how we talk about sports. And it has turned, what was once historic, unprecedented gambling scandals into almost an everyday occurrence. This banishment today of Marcano, the player banned from baseball for life for betting on the games, is just one of a handful now from this spring alone. And, while it's shocking, it really isn't. In fact, in the reporting of my book, several people predicted this moment right here. In my reporting for Charlie Hustle, I tried to interview everyone who crossed paths with Pete Rose during the peak of his fame in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in particular, I tried to interview every single person who was part of the team of investigators and executives and officials who unraveled Pete's lies in 1989. And one of those people was the deputy commissioner of baseball at the time, a man named Fave Vincent, who would later become commissioner of baseball and is also still alive today. And in one of my very first interviews with Faye Vincent back in September of 2021, so almost 3 years ago, Faye Vincent was looking out across the landscape of America, this new gambling America. And he said something that has come true again and again this spring and again today. He said there's going to be more Pete Roses and there's going to be more corruption. It's only a matter of time. And Mitch, I would suggest that maybe that time is now.
Yeah. For our listeners who perhaps don't watch sports, let's describe a little bit how it has changed. And this is what is alarming to me and it never used to be this way. There is a fine line between gambling and a game and sports. But now when you watch the game on television, first off, the betting, the gambling companies are sponsoring the games, spending a great deal of money on advertisements to the point where it's even being worked into the broadcast. So you're not just now betting on the game, who's going to win, who's going to lose by a point spread or whatever. Now it's like, who's going to hit the next home run, or here's the score, here's the likelihood of another team coming back and win. You can go 5 for 1 in gambling on this. And the broadcasters, the people that traditionally were seen as like journalists that are broadcasting the game, are in on this and talking about it as the game goes on. It's so integral now, gambling, to the game itself.
Well, and the change you just described there is a fundamental and systemic one. 10 years ago, 7 years ago, a broadcaster would have never even suggested what the spread of the game was. It was verboten. You didn't do it because, again, gambling was illegal. It was, of course, done in the shadows in voluminous amounts, but it was illegal. And so a broadcaster would have never said the spread of the game or mentioned anything even referencing gambling at all. To do so would have actually been to risk being suspended from your job as a broadcaster. And you're right. Now they are telling us, the viewer, what the odds are in a given moment of a given player hitting a home run right then. And in 36 states, we can now sit on our couches, on our phones, and place a bet on that particular player right then and there. And that's what I'm talking about here. This is a fundamental shift. And the truth is, we don't really know where this is headed.
Yeah.
This is the first generation of American children, American teenagers, American young sports viewers who are growing up in a time when the broadcasters are telling us to bet, when we go to commercial and famous stars and former athletes and icons and Hall of Famers are telling us to bet, and we just simply don't know where this is headed, except for this. What is known, and this is known and documented in medical journals again and again. Gambling is a known addictive product, a known addictive habit. It is something that is also known to affect, at a minimum, 3 to 7% of the population in an addictive way. And it is especially addictive, again, based on scientific studies, for young men. Well, who are the players who, by and large, are playing these sports, these professional sports in America today? They are young men. And they're young men with lots of free time and lots of disposable cash. And that right there is a recipe for disaster. And we're seeing it again just this week with the banishment of Tucupita Marcano for betting on baseball games.
Compulsive behavior is so center in gambling addiction. And again, I'm a sports fan, and I purposely do not gamble because I think if folks don't understand, if you're a sports fan, gambling, I suspect what it does is it makes you feel even more a part of what you're watching. Now you're going to win or lose something out of the result of this game. And it makes it even, I think, more real for something that you're already kind of into. And I know if I were to, and you could just have them on your phone, just download the app. You could do it right there. But you give them your credit card number and you're in. You're right. It's so easy. You don't have to go find a bookie anymore, like Pete Rose did. That I know it would be a problem if I ever started doing that, because they're playing into that compulsive behavior. I mean, it's quite pernicious.
Well, in fairness to Major League Baseball and every other sports league for a moment, it would be economic folly in 2024 not to go all in on gambling. Again, I mentioned those numbers before, $120 billion wagered on sports legally last year in America. So to not be a part of that would be to make yourself almost irrelevant to the times that you're living in. But you're right. It is a pernicious habit. It is an addictive habit. And we're all prone to it. Every single one of us. Pete Rose did speak to me for my book, Charlie Hustle. He granted 27 hours of interviews to me before he ultimately did stop calling me back, before he ultimately did shut down. But in that time, Pete told me something that he's said in the past before. Betting on games makes the games more interesting. And, I might disagree with Pete Rose on many things, but I will say this. I live in a state where sports wagering is legal. So, like many people, millions of people, I have a legal sports betting app on my phone. And every once in a while, especially if I'm watching games with a friend, a big game, you've gathered for the night with a couple of pals, you might say, hey, let's throw $50 on this. Let's throw $25 on this. And I can tell you definitively, it does make the games more interesting. You might care more about a Monday night game between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Houston Texans because you placed $20 on it. But there is a cost to that. Again, gambling is known to be a compulsive and an addictive behavior for 3 to 7% of the population, especially young men. And college campuses are seeing this writ large across America right now, where young men are losing money, lots of money, on their phones, watching games with their friends.
Does all of this come out of a Supreme Court ruling?
That's correct. Yeah. In 2018, the Supreme Court effectively threw open the doors to legalize gambling across America by overturning a law that said only Nevada could have legalized sports wagering. And so overnight, states fell over themselves to open up legal sports books and to legalize sports gambling in their state as essentially a tax grab. And so one by one, states began to legalize it until today. We've got something like 36 states in the District of Columbia, where this is a legal practice.
A tax grab. That is, everyone's making money off of it. The state's making money off of it. The leagues themselves are making money off it, and hence the players are now. I mean, everyone, the television rights, I guess, everyone's making money off this.
Well, everyone except for the bettors themselves, because let's be honest, the house always wins, right? That cliche, Mitch, it's true.
The house always wins. Can you not make a living by betting, by gambling, if you're very good, if you're incredibly knowledgeable about sports?
Well, there are some professional gamblers out there, but it is a highly risky endeavor for all the obvious reasons. And for anybody who watches sports, you know it even if you're betting or not. It's incredible, when you're watching these games and the line is 2.5 or 6.5 or 8.5. And suddenly, the game comes down into the final moments, and this line that seemed out of whack for most of the game suddenly almost hits right on the number. It is a stunning thing, and which makes it very hard to make a living, betting on sports games.
Let's get into Pete Rose, and thank you for laying all that out for me. I think it's important to understand what's happening in sports today. As we talk about Pete Rose, who was banned for life from baseball because of gambling, and he was banned in 1989. And I think it's important to know what's going on today. So let me ask an obvious question then as we get into Pete Rose. Is what Pete Rose did during his time of a baseball player, would it had still got him banned today? Would it have been outside of the norm of what we are talking about, what's happening today in professional sports and gambling?
So yes, absolutely. So what Pete did in the 1980s would have the same punishment today. Pete was placing bets on his own games and other baseball games with illegal bookies. Of course, this is a time when there were no legal betting apps. There were no apps at all. He was placing bets with bookies in the shadows on his own team to win, and often on other games as well. That decision broke one of the best known rules of baseball that had been established in the mid 1920s, that any person who were to wager on games in which he is a part of faces a lifetime ban for doing so. That has not changed. But obviously, based on what we just discussed, Mitch, there are some cosmic ironies to how the landscape has changed. Major League Baseball is now officially partnering with legal betting platforms. Advertise during the games, advertise during commercials, advertise at the ballpark. I was just in Cincinnati a couple weeks ago for a book event there. And the book event was held just outside the Cincinnati Reds stadium before a game. And there's a statue of Pete Rose right outside the entrance to the stadium. It's a classic statue of Pete sliding headfirst into third base, which was something he was known to do. And within about 100 feet of this statue of this man who is banned from baseball forever for gambling, there is essentially a casino bar where there are kiosks set up so that fans can walk in, place their bet on the game, and then walk right into the ballpark. And so, there are some cosmic ironies to how the world has changed, even though the rule itself has not changed.
So the rule is an old rule. Does this all come out of the Black Sox scandal in the early 20th century when the team purposefully threw the World Series? And this is a time when ball players didn't make very much money at all, but the owners made all the money. Does this rule come out of that?
Yeah, you're referencing the 1919 World Series between the Chicago White Sox and, ironically, the Cincinnati Reds. The White Sox were heavily favored to win and included a star player by the name of Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was most likely going to be a future Hall of Famer. And the White Sox lose that World Series with some very questionable play. And it comes out a couple years later that they had thrown, a handful of players had thrown the games, conspiring with bookies in Chicago to do so. It is well believed by most baseball fans, including, I'll be honest, Mitch, myself, before I began my research for my book, Charlie Hustle, that was the 1919 World Series scandal, the Black Sox scandal, that leads to the rule that says, a player may not gamble on the games. But that actually doesn't happen. It's not until 1926, 1927, when a second scandal makes news. This scandal involved two future Hall of Famers as well. Ty Cobb, who would become baseball's all-time hit leader, and Tris Speaker, again, one of baseball's best players of the early 20th century. And the allegation that emerged was that Speaker and Cobb met beneath the bleachers of a stadium near the tail end of a season and arranged the outcome of the final games of that season because the games didn't matter. The season was over. And so why not make a few bucks off of it was the allegation. This allegation was made by a former player, who was part of that meeting. And it made huge national headlines. And briefly, launched a Major League Baseball investigation. And they were going to hold hearings in Chicago in early 1927 to sort this out. But before those hearings could start, that player who made the allegations decided not to come to Chicago. To be honest, he was afraid. He was in fear of his life. This is Chicago 1927. He had no interest in coming there to talk about gamblers and bookies and dealings in the shadows. And Major League Baseball seemed to be all too happy to make this potential scandal involving two massive stars, Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker, go away. But the result of that story and those allegations was this rule that said, okay, going forward, players cannot bet on the games or they're going to face permanent banishment.
Yeah, you can't bet on any baseball games. Pete Rose, you said earlier, betted on games that he was a part of. Did he ever? And we say Black Sox. You're correct. It was White Sox. But they sort of got that moniker, Black Sox, after the scandal. Did Pete Rose ever vote against his team?
So there is no evidence or allegation that Pete Rose ever bet against the Reds. That said, there are scant few actual records. I'm talking about documents, written notes. There's a handful of notes in a notebook that I utilized for my book from the summer and spring of 1986. And there's a handful of notes from 1987 that was turned over to Major League Baseball by a whistleblower within Pete Rose's inner circle that were really the foundation of his banishment in 1989. Based on those notes and based on my interviews with people in Pete's inner circle, Pete never bet against the Reds. Pete does like to say that he always bet on his team to win. And that's at least partially true in that, again, he never bet against them. But based on those records that I laid out a moment ago, Pete isn't always betting on his team, period. By that, I mean, based on the records and the notes, maybe he bet on the Reds on Monday and Tuesday, then skipped Wednesday and Thursday, and bet again Friday and Saturday and skip Sunday.
Good, because he knows what's going on inside with the team, right? Sort of insider trading.
It's a little bit of insider trading, and the bigger problem with that, if that is how it went down, is that you're broadcasting to the bookies in the underworld what you know. Again, every bookie in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, when Pete was betting with bookies, was either fully enmeshed with organized crime or on the outskirts of it. And none of them, by the way, worked alone. That would be a very dangerous prospect. Bookies were always part of a network, and they were always calling one another in the minutes before games to level off their bets, essentially, and make sure that they would come out even regardless of the outcome. And you can be sure that if it was known that Pete wasn't betting on the Reds that night, that it would have been a discussion among the bookies about what he did or did not know.
That's interesting. Was it Pete Rose who made the bet, or did he have somebody else make the bet for him?
Pete Rose very rarely placed his own bets with bookies. He had an inner circle of men, good friends, who were willing to do anything for him. Let's remember who Pete Rose was. He wasn't just one of our greatest baseball players. He was an iconic American by the mid-1970s. One of our most famous people, period. A cultural touchstone. And so, yes, young men who he essentially collected for his inner circle were more than happy to do lots of things for Pete, including place his bets with bookies, and they did so. And I interviewed for my book 3 different men who not just placed Pete's bets on sports, but placed Pete's bets on baseball. And Pete has given conflicting statements over the years about whether or not he was addicted to gambling. He said he was addicted in 1990 when he was facing federal charges for tax evasion and looking for leniency from the court. And he said it in a sort of mealy-mouthed way in a 2004 memoir in which he finally came clean after 15 years of lies and said, yes, he had bet on baseball. Short of that, Pete has, really denied or acted as if he's never been addicted to gambling. Based on my reporting and interviews with the people who placed his bets on baseball and with the people who had a front row seat to Pete's gambling in the 1970s and 80s, there is no question in my mind, and no question, more importantly, in their minds, that Pete was addicted. As one of his good friends told me, by the mid-1980s, it was like, he said, Pete was a 747 spiraling out of the sky. There was nothing they could do. There was no way to stop it.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Keith O'Brien. Keith O'Brien is the author of the book Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose in the Last Glory Days of Baseball. You make a point that it's important if you're going to talk about the fall of Pete Rose, and you also need to talk about the rise of Pete Rose, and why did we care about Pete Rose to begin with. And you write in your introduction, this is off the top of my head, so if I get it wrong, you'll correct it, but you write in the introduction that Pete Rose was the most extraordinary, ordinary athlete perhaps ever. Tell me about the appeal and the rise of Pete Rose.
I think that's true about Pete. What I tried to do with this book was not look at his story through the prism of baseball, although there is a lot of baseball in the book, of course, but look at his story through the prism of him being a man. And when you do that, I think it's just a far more interesting story. Pete was born and raised in Cincinnati.
Which is interesting because that's the team he makes. Cincinnati Reds is the team he plays for, Phillies and others, but it's the Reds where you really know Pete Rose. It's uncommon today for a Major League Baseball player to come from where the team he's playing for is.
It is uncommon, but Pete grows up about 6 miles from the Reds Stadium. He grows up on the west side of Cincinnati, a working class part of town. He was in an especially working class neighborhood on that side of town. He's a man of ordinary athleticism, ordinary talents in the entirety of his childhood. I mean, all the way up through high school. He is never the best baseball player on his own teams. By right, I think he shouldn't even have made the minors. Today, he wouldn't make the minors. He would just disappear. And so for all of these reasons, I think it's sort of a miracle that we ever come to know the name Pete Rose. But Pete knows about himself these things. He knows that he's not the most talented player, and so he knows he's going to have to play harder, try harder, work harder than the other guy. And that becomes his entire persona, this Charlie Hustle persona that you mentioned at the outset of the conversation. He's going to outwork people. He's going to out-hustle people. And he's going to scrape and claw his way to the mountaintop. And that story, Mitch, is, I think, a big reason why Pete Rose became an American icon. Because if you think about it, that story is really the American story. It's the bedtime story that we like to tell our children or our grandchildren at night. That if you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, you can do anything. That's our story. And that was the Pete Rose story. That story was real. And so people did gravitate to it, especially as he became a major leaguer and became a bona fide star. By the end of the 1960s, this kid, rookie nobody from the working class side of town in Cincinnati, who probably never should have made it, is now a back-to-back National League batting champion and about to have one of the greatest decades of baseball that anyone would ever put together. By the end of the 1970s, the Sporting News, essentially the Bible of sports in those years, specifically the Bible of baseball, will name Pete Rose the player of the decade, the player of the 1970s.
Yeah. The head first slide, it was almost like a dive, right? I mean, he was in the air when when he left his feet for a bit. That it was almost unheard of to do that head first slide when he started doing it.
Yeah, indeed. In 1963, when Pete Rose is a rookie and he's sliding headfirst into bases and he's sprinting down to first base on a walk, uh, his teammates and opponents, frankly, didn't like it. They thought he was a showboat. They thought he was showing them up by trying so hard, by working so hard. And that is in part one reason why, Mickey Mantle and his teammate from the New York Yankees, Whitey Ford, would give Pete Rose that nickname, Charlie Hustle. They were watching him play one day at spring training in 1963, and frankly, they found it absurd. Like who is this Charlie Hustle? But Pete Rose does with that nickname something that he will do many times over the course of his career, many times over the course of his life. Frankly, something that Pete Rose is still doing today. He rebrands this moment. He spins it in his own favor. And when he does make the Reds in 1963, the big club, and when he does become the opening day starter at second base, and when he does begin to travel by plane for the very first time to cities he never thought he would visit, New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and he meets sports writers there for the first time. Pete Rose is more than happy to tell these beat writers the story of the day that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle because Pete said he liked the way I played.
And of course, we remember it's still this famous moment in the All-Star game, sometime in the 1970s, I forget exactly what year, where it's a meaningless game. Well, even though players took it much more seriously then than they do now, it's still mostly a meaningless game. Doesn't count for any records other than the All-Star game itself. But he barrels into Ray Fosse, who is an up-and-coming catcher for the Oakland Athletics, recently passed away, longtime broadcaster here where I'm broadcasting from the San Francisco Bay Area, and ruins his shoulder, basically, and really alters Ray Fosse's career. And this is an exhibition game. How you talk to a lot of former teammates of Pete Rose. Pete Rose was a part of what was known as the Big Red Machine. This is when the Cincinnati Reds win back-to-back World Series in 1975, 1976, have other Hall of Fame members on that team like Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, who has also passed away, Tony Perez, and others. How you interviewed a lot of former teammates of Pete Rose. How did his teammates feel about him?
Yeah, well, so I did interview as many former teammates and former players as I could because I wanted to understand what they thought. As you said, I couldn't interview Ray Fosse, unfortunately, because he passed in the fall of 2021, just as my research was beginning. Fosse, of course, would go on to have a career with the Athletics, but when that collision happened in July 1970, at the end of that All-Star game, he was the catcher for the Cleveland Indians at that time, sort of the Johnny Bench of the American League, not just an up-and-coming catcher, but really believed to be the best young catcher in the American League. That play would, alter his career. To answer your question, I think what captures the divide on Pete Rose among his colleagues, and by that I mean players, is that play itself. That play comes in the bottom of the 12th inning in a tie game, played at Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. Pete Rose's parents are sitting behind home plate. His wife is there. President Richard Nixon is there. Mickey Mantle, by that time, is in the broadcast booth. That game that night, the All-Star Game 1970, will draw a television audience on NBC of some 50 million viewers. 50 million, again, for, as you pointed out, an exhibition game. This was a huge deal. And Pete will slam into Fosse at home plate in a close play to win that game. And, these days, young sports fans or even, older sports fans who have forgotten, look back at that moment and and almost hold it up as an example of Pete's absurdity, almost like it's a character flaw or something. But when I went back and lived inside that game in my research, it's a different story. There were many Hall of Famers on the field that night, 24 Hall of Famers on the field that night. And many of them defended Pete Rose. They believed that it was the absolute right play. Fosse was blocking the plate, and Rose had to try to win. What was he supposed to do? Politely slide around him, they said. One person who defended Pete Rose that night would go on to become a Hall of Famer as a manager, and is still working for Major League Baseball today. Certainly will be well known to any baseball fan. That's Joe Torre. Joe Torre, the later the manager of the New York Yankees, who was an all-star on that team as a catcher for the St. Louis Cardinals. Torre defends Rose that night. But amid these players who defend him, there were others that night, including at times Pete Rose's own friends, who thought it was too much, that he had gone too far. Frank Robinson, himself a future Hall of Famer, and a former teammate of Pete's on the Cincinnati Reds, was now playing for the Baltimore Orioles. He was in Fosse's locker room after the game. And Robbie, as he was known to the players, asked Ray, could he have gotten around you? Could he have slid around you? And Ray nodded yes. I think he could have. And that, that really burned, Robinson. He was upset about that and told people that night that he thought Rose had sort of done Fosse dirty. And so that play, it really sort of captures so much about Pete Rose and the polarizing nature of his persona. And that was borne out in my interviews, Mitch. There are players who I interviewed who defend Rose and would do anything for him, and there are those who feel almost the complete opposite about him.
Yeah. So again, I think it's 1979. The Sporting News declares Pete Rose Athlete of the Decade. A few years later, 1985, Pete Rose breaks Ty Cobb's single hit career record, which is seen as this sort of insurmountable record to break. So it's a big deal to break it. It's probably on par with, breaking Henry Aaron's 755 home runs when Barry Bonds did it, which of course maybe that'll be your next book. But it's after this point. Is this when we start to get the fall? When do the allegations of gambling come to light?
Well, the allegations that will ultimately bring Pete down reach Major League Baseball via the rumor mill in February 1989. And that will essentially spark a 6-month investigation, an odyssey that will wind its way through the state and federal courts. And ultimately lead to Pete's banishment in late August of that year, late August 1989. But that moment and that scandal, doesn't begin out of nowhere. One thing that I had to do with the narrative in Charlie Hustle was recognize this isn't a simple rise and a simple fall. While Pete is, scraping and clawing his way to the mountaintop, while Pete is, setting records, winning World Series, becoming an American icon, becoming a beloved player to many Americans, he is making decisions in the shadows as far back as 20 years earlier that are going to lead to his ultimate downfall in 1989. And so, one thing I had to do in the writing of the book was, bring him back to that mountaintop and remind readers why we did care about him. And so, we're going to be on the field in some of those moments of baseball glory. And there are many of them. But while that's happening, Pete is making these choices, building these relationships with bookies, burning relationships with bookies, recruiting guys from his inner circle, losing guys from his inner circle that is ultimately going to lead to the problems in 1989. It's almost, when you go back and look at it, Mitch, it's like a slow train coming. You can feel it coming. You can see it coming. You want to tell Pete, to get off the tracks, to get out of the way, and he can't.
It didn't have to end with a lifetime banning, did it?
It didn't. Based on my reporting, again, not my opinion, but my reporting and my interviews with people who were in the room at Major League Baseball in 1989. If Pete Rose is honest, in any of the early meetings in which they asked him point blank, are you doing this? Are you betting on baseball? I believe the whole narrative is different. And I don't mean to suggest that Pete wouldn't have been banned or faced a punishment. He would have. He absolutely would have. He had violated this well-known rule, this rule that every player knew. But one thing we've forgotten about Pete in the last 35 years, while he's been banned from baseball and has sort of made mistake after mistake off the field, is that this scandal in 1989 was bad for the game. This was not good for Major League Baseball. And so if they could have done anything to salvage him, to send him to treatment, to put him back together again, they absolutely would have done that. But Pete gives them no opportunity to do so. He lies again and again in 1989. He denies the facts, even when the facts are laid out in black and white before him. He cannot admit what everybody, any objective viewer would find to be true, that yes, he has bet on baseball. He can't do it. And, Pete's received a lot of criticism for that in the last 35 years. And I would say in general, Pete Rose deserves all the criticism he gets for his lies in particular. These are lies that hurt lots of people. But what does an addict do, Mitch, when faced with his or her problem, when faced with the truth of what that problem is doing? An addict diminishes and denies. And that is what Pete Rose does. He does it for 15 years, and in some ways, he's still doing it today.
You said that you had 27 hours worth of interviews with Pete Rose, and then he stopped returning your calls. Do you know what happened?
I do not. Pete Rose and I never had a falling out. We never had a cross word, never had an argument. But I will say this, I was pushing him. I think when any journalist gets access in particular to a famous person, it's important to get them to draw outside the lines. Anyone who's been interviewed hundreds of times, thousands of times, tends to fall back into the same stories. It's just human nature. It's what we do. And so when I had access to Pete, I was pushing him to explain things that he hadn't explained before, to go places he hadn't gone before. And to be fair to Pete for a moment, he did do that. Pete did say things and talk to me about things and admit things and explain things for this book that he has never talked about or answered for or explained before. But I think in the end, I was pushing Pete as far as he was willing to go.
There is this perennial argument in baseball about the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose, not just Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson, someone we talked about earlier in the century, but today, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Mark McGwire. To me, it's kind of the appeal of baseball that always has these scandals, to be honest. I kind of like the scandals of baseball because it's part of its history. It's always there. I'm a baseball fan. But a lot, now a lot of these other members were not banned permanently from baseball. Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds are on the ballot for Hall of Fame. Sports writers are deciding not to vote for them to join the Hall of Fame because of the allegations over steroids and performance enhancement drugs. But you make this interesting point, and Pete Rose is not in the Hall of Fame, even though arguably, just as a baseball player, he should be. But you make this point, we didn't always judge a player on their personality or their behavior as if they should be eligible or be able or be voted into the Hall of Fame. And if you even look at the original class of the Hall of Fame, it was just a handful of players, and it included Ty Cobb, who maybe some of this apocryphal, I don't know, but largely considered the devil incarnate, made it into the Hall of Fame. We didn't always judge a player based on his behavior.
That's right. And then I want to be clear here. One thing that makes this book unique is that I'm not here to make an argument for Pete Rose. I'm not here to make an argument against Pete Rose. My book's not even really about the Hall of Fame at all. I wanted to look at his story through the prism of history, tell that story, let people come to their own conclusions. But yeah, obviously, as a baseball fan like you and like others, I've wrestled with these debates. The Pete Rose debate and the debate over the steroid guys. This is, one of the great late night sports bar arguments. What to do with baseball's ne'er-do-wells. And you're 100% right. This phenomenon of us treating our athletes as paragons of morality is a fairly new one. For decades, not just in that early class when they voted Ty Cobb in, but for decades, sports writers spilled no ink debating the moral worth of a player. And, every sort of ne'er-do-well you can imagine is in Cooperstown, is in the Hall of Fame. Racists, philanderers, gamblers, drug users, drug dealers.
Other gamblers.
Oh, yeah. They're all there. They're all there. And so, it's only in recent decades that we have, applied a moral test to our athletic icons. In particular, I would say baseball icons. And, so for me at this point, Mitch, I've sort of, probably at some point in the last 35 years, held every particular position on Pete Rose and the steroid guys. But right now, my feeling is this. I think, frankly, we've lost perspective. We simply don't know what we don't know about our athletic icons. And I would submit we're going to know even less going forward. In the 1970s, sports writers had intimate access to clubhouses and locker rooms. That came at times with another side effect that wasn't good for the truth. They got to know the players so well, they protected them by not telling us, the sports fans, the public, what they really knew. But what they did know was the players. And we don't have that kind of access anymore. Journalists often only get a chance to interview the star athletes in a press conference for 5 minutes after a game. Access to clubhouses and locker rooms is significantly restricted. We simply don't know what we don't know about players. And so for that reason, for me anyway, when it comes to Pete Rose and all the other ne'er-do-wells you mentioned, the Barry Bondses and the Roger Clemenses of the world, I now believe that we should enshrine them or not enshrine them based on what they did on the field. And then if what they did off the field is so wrong, let's put it on the plaque at Cooperstown. Let's put it there in bronze for perpetuity right next to their accomplishments.
Is an early influence on this sort of creation of a morality test for a ball player with black ball players in the 70s who were involved in a cocaine scandal?
That is certainly the time frame where things began to change. You're referencing the cocaine scandal of the early 1980s that would ensnare many players. But two, I think most notably, one was Dave Parker, star player for the Pittsburgh Pirates and later the Cincinnati Reds and Oakland A's, and Keith Hernandez, star player for the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Mets. I would submit, that both of those men are Hall of Famers. In particular, Dave Parker. Dave Parker, I urge anyone, go look at his numbers from the 70s and 80s and compare it to today. He is a Hall of Famer. But I believe Dave Parker pays a price. He pays a price for the cocaine scandal. And I think, too, Mitch, he pays a price for his race. Dave Parker wasn't just a black player. He was an outspoken, flamboyant, in-your-face black player. At a time when the press corps in baseball and the voters for the Hall of Fame were primarily white. And I think for all of those reasons, Dave Parker pays a price that I think, again, is wrong and unconscionable. We should be voting on players based on what they did on the field. It is truly the only thing we know. Everything else does not matter.
Keith O'Brien, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Mitch. It was my pleasure.
Keith O'Brien has been our guest again. He has joined us for a conversation about his book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball.